I looked up debunk the skepticism of moon landings, and it's all been worked for itself.
Yeah. We'll wait a couple minutes more to see who shows up.
No.
We're going.
Say again?
We're already.
Recording? Okay. Yeah.
If you want, you can get started. I need to go grab my water.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's the sun is out at the moment. Anyway, we'll see what happens as evening wears on. I think I have lived through at least 2 or 3 seasons today already. Maybe some of you have as well. This will be our last session, and I think we can make it through what I put on the sheet in terms of the material. I also think it is probably helpful to you just take a moment at the outset today to think about where we have been, what we're going to do this evening, and then we'll all go our separate ways and we'll ponder some of these things in our own way. You will remember that 3 weeks ago, I sketched rather broadly, thinking perhaps globally about religious extremism, not just Christian extremism or Jewish extremism or Muslim extremism, but religious extremism more broadly. And I think, or I thought, that might be a helpful way of setting up how we think about Christian extremism in North America at the present time, especially as Tim Alberta focuses on it with regard to the evangelical community in this country and what is or has happened. From there, we moved on to Tim Alberta's discussion of his own father, who had been a Wall Street finance person, who had a conversion experience, became an evangelical Presbyterian minister in a suburb of Detroit. I might add, a conservative suburb of Detroit. And as Tim Alberta is working on some of these issues as a journalist, working for The Atlantic, and so on, his father dies rather suddenly, and I suspect prematurely age-wise as well. And this was traumatic for him because he felt very close to his father, and it prompted him then to go back to his home church, where his father had been the minister for decades. And he realized just how far into a kind of evangelical conservatism or right-wing religious experience his father had moved. And in discussions with his father's associate pastor, who was now kind of in charge of the pastoral ministry of that church, he realized how problematic this was and how Pastor Winians, the associate pastor, really felt like things had gotten off the rails. And the merging of the gospel with a kind of notion, a particular notion of American patriotism, was problematic. Things, the state and the church had been overlapped too much, and the flag and the cross as well, as symbols of all of that. And from there, we then moved on to Lynchburg, Virginia. Jerry Falwell and Jerry Falwell's emergence on the national scene, and how he too began as a separatist, religion and government, the state, had come to merge them and to see his goal, his job, as to, in a sense, re-Christianize in his frame of reference the United States that had gone astray into secular humanism and hedonism and so on and so on and so forth. Well, long story short, as you remember, that comes crashing down. He dies, his son takes over the university, and the dominoes start to fall. And then we also began looking at Greg Locke, another of what I termed as the kingdom builders. In the Jerry Falwell kind of line, Greg Locke, Juliet Mountain, Tennessee, begins to create this phenomenon there. And as I told you last week, Steve mentioned to me that Greg Locke is coming to Missoula in July, I think, early July. And I also think I mentioned that in the title, and I don't remember it precisely, but the word freedom appears in the title. Just hold that thought for a moment. And how Greg Locke ultimately was willing to sit down with Tim Alberta and talk about, or be interviewed, let's put it this way. And how Tim Alberta was apprehensive about how that conversation would go. It didn't go the way Tim Alberta feared it might. In fact, Greg Locke was very self-reflective and skittish, insecure in a lot of ways. And Tim Alberta, as we talked last time, couldn't quite figure all of this out or make sense out of it. But he was not set at ease by this fact at all. He realized that, to abbreviate, Greg Locke had realized that there was a market for crazy. There was a market for the bizarre, and it was part of a church growth strategy. And Greg Locke was perfectly at ease, moving back and forth between self-reflectivity and the bizarre. And that brings us today to Brian Zond. You realize now, I have been picking and choosing. Those of you who have read the book, you know, I have tried to set up a narrative line by picking and choosing. What you have also realized, as I said in the paragraph at the outset, we're going to follow Tim Alberta into this world. But you have also realized that I've had a little input into that whole business by what I've selected, what I've chosen, and my own commentary on this. What you have also realized, I think, is that you too have had input into this. As I was mentioning to David, I'm doing the same presentations in Columbia Falls on Thursdays. The experience is different because the group is different. Both, I might add, as compliments to you and them, very interesting folks who think. And it's been my pleasure. So what I think we will do now, then, is to take a look, then, at Brian Zahn, what I've termed seeing the light, the reconversion of Brian Zahn, and the courage to push back. I'll go through this. I'll go through my remarks at first. We'll have some conversation, and then, as I warned you, we're going to take a little look into Timothy Snyder's book on freedom. Maybe I'm being either hyperbolic or too sensitive, but I think both in the church and in our public life, freedom has become a catchword. We're all for freedom, but we don't think very deeply about what freedom might mean in different dimensions of the term. Greg Locke's notion of freedom may not be mine, Steve. May not be yours either. Timothy Snyder is a historian of Eastern European history at Yale, and he has some things to say that I think overlap with a Christian, New Testament, Pauline, maybe a Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian notion of freedom in the Christian life as well. I don't want to leave out the Catholics. I don't want to leave anybody out, but because I probably know the Lutheran tradition best, I see it pretty deeply rooted, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, given what we've learned so far, you might draw the conclusion that American evangelicalism is lock, stock, and barrel on the crazy side of things. But I think that wouldn't be correct. And it is the case that Tim Alberta relates stories of many individuals who push back. In the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, elsewhere, people who have pushed back, and very often they have taken principled stands and exercised courage, and they have paid a price for that. But they're not all crazies in his book. There are people who take a principled stand, and I would put Brian Zond into that category. He's an interesting case because as a teenager, he had attended a revival at Missouri Western State University and had a life-changing encounter with Christ. And as a result, he became what he described as a Jesus freak. Now, some of us are old enough to remember that terminology, a Jesus freak. He was part of the charismatic renewal, or the charismatic revival of the 1960s, and immediately began to engage in the so-called gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues and so on and so forth. And we might add, he was rather successful and began to exercise a leadership role in that world in Kansas City. He started a ministry called the Catacombs, for example, which, as Alberta describes it, was part music venue, part coffee house, part headquarters for the young people of the Jesus movement in Kansas City. In 1981, the Catacombs, anybody been to the Catacombs in Rome? I don't think this really resembles those too much. But in 1981, the Catacombs morphed into an actual church which he called Word of Life. It quickly became a sensation, attracting loads of young college kids, young professionals, people who had generally become disaffected from more mainline church bodies. And Zahn, then 22 years of age, appointed himself the lead pastor. In some worlds, you can just do that. Even though he had absolutely no formal theological training. None. The church, over time, moved venues, upsized, and eventually built a massive state-of-the-art sanctuary. Word of Life was clearly a mega church. And as such, its influence began to spread far and wide. Attendance exploded. And by all external objective measures, it was a success. It had people, money, and power. But as Tim Alberta tells it, Brian Zahnd generally came to the point where he started to feel that something was wrong here. Something was wrong. Zahnd didn't immediately pull the plug on things in the church, which by then was a formidable institution, and he continued to play along for some time with the culture wars of the day. Nationalistic sentiments after 9/11, the struggles against abortion and gay marriage, Republican politicians frequently stood in the church's pulpit. The list could go on and on, I'm sure. But in 2004, Brian Zahnd could take it no longer. And he finally stood up and told the congregation that they were going to go in a different direction. He still did some bobbing and weaving, trying to keep the church together, but that too would come to an end. After a particularly searing experience, for Brian Zahnd, Alberta describes what happened. And I'm just going to read, guess I should get the right book. Around the turn of the century, Zahnd began to sense that something wasn't right, as I have said. The church was full of very nice people. They had all grown up together, basically, if not literally, then by association, from subversive teenage zealots to refined middle-aged church folks, but they hadn't grown up spiritually. Theirs was a Christianity, Zahnd began to realize, so heavy on style and feeling and expression that it eschewed doctrinal substance. In this sense, they had become every bit as complacent and consumeristic as the churches they once rebelled against. There wasn't anything countercultural about what we were doing. This was the culture. Just with a few Bible verses drizzled over it. Zahnd said, we started off as these radical Jesus freaks, but over time we turned into a bunch of Republicans with Jesus fishes on our SUVs. It all began to feel facile and thin. And Zahnd had never been secure about his lack of theological training to that point, but now it gnawed at him. He would come home Sunday afternoons feeling strangely unfulfilled, like a man leaving a banquet with his stomach still rumbling. I had a crisis of faith, but it wasn't about Christ, it was about Christianity, American Christianity. The pastor recalled, I just came to the conclusion that Jesus deserves a better Christianity than this. And I needed to go looking for it. Now get a load of this. After stumbling for a while, Zahnd finally discovered the church fathers. Excuse the gender language here. The patristics, the church fathers. These were the experts who helped establish Christian doctrine in the ancient world. Augustine of Hippo, Gregory of Nyssa, Irenaeus of Lyon, Maximus the Confessor, known in academic settings as the patristics. These men merged Christian philosophy with applied theology, furnishing Zahn with an intellectual understanding of Christ he never knew existed. Now, here, I'm going to overstate the case. We Lutherans have a really interesting way, often, about studying Christianity. We look at the Bible, then we jump to the 16th century. If you're Catholic or Episcopalian, or strange people like me, you deal with the patristics as well. The church fathers, and I would say mother. There are a few mothers in there too. But Brian Zahn is having not only a conversion religious experience, but an intellectual experience, which is, I think, really interesting. This is skipping on a little bit. He says, the following Sunday and in the Sundays that followed, Zahn made clear to his congregation what the new Word of Life church would be. I began to critique the American empire as not a kind of biblical Israel, but a kind of historical Babylon. I told them that God was not on our side, that God raised up Jesus, not America. The pastor recalled I was pretty direct about it. You didn't have to read between the lines anymore. They got it and they left. They got it and they left. It was a slow leak at first, a Sunday no-show here, a Bible study absence there, and then a gusher. Entire cliques and social networks quit the church altogether. People defected by the dozens and then by the hundreds. Within a few years of Zahn's announcement, the church had lost more than 1,500 members. The pastor was prepared for casualties, but he couldn't have predicted the scale of the exodus. Looking back, the hardest part was overhearing all the accusatory whispers, how he had succumbed to a weakened, watered-down Christianity when precisely the opposite was true. They would say, Brian's backsliding. If anything, I was front-sliding, he says. He said, laughing, suddenly, I am more committed to Jesus than I've ever been, but they saw it differently because when you're stuck in the left-right paradigm, that's all you can see. They would say, Brian's become a Democrat, but I'm not a Democrat. I'm a kingdom person. Okay? We can have all sorts of reactions to that, but it's an interesting kind of phenomenon about this guy. Well, after the events just described, Tim Alberta tells the readers of his arrival on a Sunday morning for the services at the church. At the church, there were few cars in the lot. A lot that could hold, if not thousands, many hundreds. While Zahn had told him that the church was a fraction of its former size, he was not prepared, Tim Alberta was not prepared for what he saw. In a sanctuary that could hold 1,000 people, there may have been 150. He says he had to double check to make sure he had the right time. Maybe this was just a smaller service, but one of many. Hardly the case. This was the only service. The portrait of Brian Zahn presented by Tim Alberta is of a man clear-eyed about what had happened to him and his church, but totally, and I underscore totally, at peace about the changes he had made. He doesn't appear to be a man with second thoughts, says Alberta, but a man secure in the power of Christ and his kingdom. Long gone was the preaching designed to whip the congregation into a frenzy against the perceived enemies of Christianity who are trying to destroy Christian America. What does perplex him is that so many can't see the disservice that is being done to Christ in the gospel. Many of us could, I suspect, say amen, hopefully without becoming smug or blind in our own misplaced forms of counterculturalism. The picture of Zahn presented by Alberta is of a man who takes no pleasure in the blindness he sees in so many of these evangelicals around him, many who had been his friends and associates for a long, long time. I conclude this section with another reading from Alberta's book. Looking back, this is Alberta writing, Zahn is grateful for losing much of his congregation all those years ago. Downsizing so dramatically allowed the pastor to connect with his people more intimately and to make sure everyone was on board with his mission and his message. This not only made for a healthier church, it insulated Word of Life from the turmoil of the Trump era. In fact, Zahn told me at a moment when many of his clergy counterparts were bleeding members from their churches, Word of Life was experiencing real growth for the first time in over a decade. And Alberta, as he describes this, will write about Brian Zahn saying that, yes, they were broadcasting their services. He never felt like that was the optimal way to worship, but it's the world in which we live. He did say to Tim Alberta that he would often get calls from people, and many of them from people in Texas, who say, I can't find a church I'm willing to go to in my community. There just isn't one, and that's why they're dropping in online, because they see something of a different variety. I don't know that Brian Zahn, that is, has an answer for that problem, but he thinks that people are looking for serious relationships, church fellowship, that has integrity and depth. And so, Brian Zahn has no regret, in retrospect, has no regrets. I would say if the faithful church is inherently countercultural, as I, and I've said this before to you, as I, for one, think it should be, it is inevitable that we come back to the question, what are we going to be countercultural about? I think there are a whole lot of right-wing religious folks in our discussion, Christian folks, who think they're countercultural too, and they may be. But are we being countercultural for important, substantive, indeed, may we say, the right things? Now, what does it really mean then? And what does it look like to love the neighbor? Our vice president, at one point this spring, this winter, made the comment that there is a tradition in historic Christianity. Now, what that means is you love your family first, then your immediate neighbor, person in the community, and then you get geographically far enough out. When all of that is taken care of, then you might worry about somebody else in some other part of the world. I think Pope Francis had something to say about that. What does it mean to be in the world, broadly speaking, but not of it? Seems to me that sounds a little bit biblical, doesn't it? And I would add maybe, not just not of it, but perhaps not afraid of it. Comes back to a comment you made a couple times ago about fear. Now, there are things probably to legitimately be afraid of, but if you see the world outside your enclave as threatening and hostile, it's easy to be afraid when you might do better to be open, to being open and engaging. What does it mean to share the planet, both near and far, with others of different religions? Well, I won't give my simple answer. It'll come up again later. But let me rephrase this. Those of you who have been in the Middle East know what a tell is. In the ancient world, there was a community, and then it disappeared, and they built on top of it, and pretty soon you got a mound. They call it a tell, and archaeologists then can work back down through that. I remember, I can't remember who it was, but said, and they're from Chicago. He said, Chicago is a tell. The only difference is we're all living at the same time in this tell of different communities, different ethnicities, different religions, and we're a mound. So the issue is, how do we live together? What does it mean if we are living in this world that maybe Brian Zahn would like us to live in, to embrace change and to learn from the world about what it might be, what it might mean to be faithful rather than simply resist the world at every turn? Can we learn from the secular world about what care of the neighbor might be? Can we learn from the secular world about things that might enhance Christian engagement with diversity and not simply be afraid of the other? In light of these questions, that's how I would like to take up this book and think about freedom. Because as I said before, I think freedom is really crucial to us in this country. It's really crucial to us in Christianity. And some of you might remember he wrote a little book some years ago on tyranny as well. But before we go there, questions, ideas, topics, things to think about. I don't need to just race through this. We need to.
You said Brian John's kind of 22. Did he ever go for more formal training with any particular?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know that he did, but as Tim Alberta tells the story, Brian Zahn became obsessed with studying.
Study on one's own is good. I was just
Yeah,
curious if
yeah,
he ever
yeah.
sought out mentorship even of any.
And maybe he did. I'm sure he moved in the direction of people who understood what he was going through and what he was trying to learn. Whether he actually went and sought at a reputable institution coursework and so on. I'm not sure about that, but I don't remember reading that.
What's the status of his church and its mission today?
The only thing I really know, I haven't gone online to search around, but he's in his 70s now, I think, and it's up to date as to the point when Tim Alberta wrote his book. That's what I know. But he is absolutely convinced, I think, from what Tim Alberta says, that there is space out here for people who are really searching for substantive religious experience, serious relationships, and there are people who are just hungry for that.
Yeah, I don't know if you may be going to get to this in a bit, but I was interested in the way the book ends. The last couple of chapters kind of give the impression of what you were saying, that there are people who are pushing back, and the Southern Baptist Convention even came out against abuse by the clergy and so on.
Finally, yes.
Yeah, and he sort of leaves the impression that maybe this is going to have a happy ending, but you can't. I noticed that the book was written in 2023, or maybe it came out in 2024, but before the election. And after the election, I think David French has made this point, it really was evangelicals who put Trump over the top as being a very kind of a considerable body and very heavily oriented to him. So you don't get the impression that the whole of American evangelicalism had a change of heart. He just sort of stopped a few months before.
Well,
and I don't know if you have any insight into what he has written since, or.
Well, I know he's on to another project, but I haven't seen much about it, and he's not yet to a point where he's making rounds again on the media. So I'm not sure, but if there are changes afoot, they are going to play themselves out in something other than a straight line, and in some other time frame than a short time frame, I suspect. We know that in our world, we'd like this fixed day after tomorrow. Historically, it doesn't tend to work that way. So, and I guess, honestly, we don't know how this is going to turn out, even over the broader term. But I think it's a mistake to think everybody is in this right-wing, religious, right-wing Christian camp, and everybody's happy about that.
What might be the percentages, though, of that, the two different camps within that culture?
I don't know that I know, David.
Yeah.
You might have more information than I do on that. I think it's in many ways hard to assess, because there's some people who don't want to talk to pollsters. I think, now, if you just look at the overarching media ecosystem out there, for a long, long time, the word has been about the decline of Christianity in North America. probably starting with the mainline denominations first, but, the Catholics have struggled, and evangelicals are struggling. I have read this book this past winter by two evangelical ministers in Orlando, Florida, they seem like really reasonable guys, but they're interested in what they call the de-churching of America. And they say that from the year 2000 to whenever they wrote this book, 23, 4, 5, 40 million people who attended church regularly are no longer going at all. They're not saying unchurched, they're talking about de-churching. And so the larger narrative that you just kind of pick up in general from the media ecosystem is the decline of Christianity. In the last year, I've heard several commentators say that seems to have leveled out and stopped. Now, what that means, I don't know. Linda.
Help me with this. There's a verse that says, I came not to bring you a plowshare, but a sword. Is that?
Came not to bring a sword, but beat your swords into plowshares?
No, it's not beating your swords into plowshares. But the gist of the verse, I think, is that because of, Jesus is saying, because of me, you're going to have more trouble, not less. And even though the goal is peace, and
Yeah, I mean, there are verses, and Jesus speaking to his disciples and sending them out and so on and so forth. There's a recognition that there's going to be opposition and families may be torn apart. I think it's not so much a future thing. It's a description of what has already been taking place. Remember, the Gospels are written, the earliest Gospel is written at least probably 40 years after Jesus' death, and Matthew and Luke and John are even later than that. So they already have experience on the ground as they tell the Jesus story.
so if we continue to preach what I might think is the gospel, we're going to create disharmony.
Yeah.
Good examples of that, the whole gender discussion, where people in the church fought long and hard, were influenced by people who were living in that reality, studied science, and then said, we're going to love people as they are.
Yeah.
Well, that created a lot of disharmony in other areas.
Yeah, and I would say we would be willing to engage disharmony, maybe even in some cases welcome disharmony for the right reasons. You've got to be careful about being cockeyed, destructive, and saying, oh, I'm engaging disharmony and anger and blowback, I must be doing something right.
True.
That doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So when we think about the narratives of Christianity that we think kind of describe the heart of the matter, loving rather than hating, and we could just go down the line, then we will be running into people who think we're wrong in some respects. But I'm willing to stand on that hill and take negative reactions. Let's take the LGBTQ plus example. I think we also have to be open to maybe learning something. Namely, learning something about human sexuality and gender. I think I've learned a lot of things, and I'm sure you could say the same thing. I don't consider myself in any sense an expert about those things, but I've listened a lot to people who talk out of that point, that perspective, and it seems to me, if you look at a continuum, every one of us in this room, every one of us on the planet are in some continuum on the continuum of gender and sexuality. And when we realize that some people may be born of one binary side or another, their self-identity of gender doesn't square with what was put down as their sex at birth. Now, if all of that's correct, and if the church is trying to learn and trying to live out its creed and ministry to loving the neighbor, maybe we all need to step back a ways and say, we need to listen to you. Talk to us. Tell us what we should know that we don't probably know, or how we should feel. And goodness sakes, we'll never go wrong. Listening before we speak will never go wrong. Caring, even when we don't understand something. I just don't think we go wrong there. Becky.
I have a cousin who believes that all the LGBTQ stuff is a birth defect. It's not that you don't love them, but it's a birth defect. Drives me crazy.
Yeah. Well,
How many times have many of us heard, love the sinner but hate the sin? I mean, I've heard that. Growing up in the South forever.
Yeah. And I guess I am of the this is just in terms of operation. I'm of the mind that it's really hard to argue people out of their view of that. What will do it faster than anything else is when one of their grandkids shows up. One of their own kids show up. Then all of a sudden, the conversation becomes very, very different. And if nothing more, some people are just willing to sit back and say nothing and love their grandkids with open arms. And that seems to me success in some ways.
Well, I didn't mean to drag us onto that issue per se. What my point is that if we preach the gospel, we are going to die on that hill.
Probably you're speaking metaphorically here. Yeah, and I guess in that sense, that's where a healthy church, that's a hill a healthy church would die on. The church we attend in Portland, and Portland is different than Kalispell. I mean, you can figure that out on the issue of human sexuality. But on any given Sunday morning, there are gay couples, transgendered folks sitting in the pews. That congregation for a long time had a lesbian woman married when they could, married to a UCC, United Church of Christ pastor. And the church, in the process of calling her, the Lutheran church, had to work through a lot of things. And there were a few people who left. I will tell you, by the time she left the church, that church, for another call, maybe 3 years ago, there would not have been one human being in that congregation who wouldn't have died on that hill for Robin. Literally fell in love with her. There's something beautiful about that, absolutely beautiful. And I know my kids, who are now middle-aged adults, it's hard to believe, about in the aughts, 2000 aughts, maybe 2005 or 6, when Steve, maybe you can help me, there was a nationwide study done on the issue of gay marriage, homosexuality, and the majority of Americans were opposed. And my daughters said, Dad, Mom, your generation's simply going to have to die off to get over this. And I thought they were probably right. Approximately 10 years later, if you think things don't change quickly, they did another nationwide study. Overwhelmingly, the American public was open to gay marriage and homosexuality and transgender and so on and so forth. What I do not condone is politicians playing on the transgender thing with regard to sports. I'm sorry. You're too cheap when you do that. And there is an issue. I have a niece who works for the Montana High School Association, and guess what she's in charge of? Referees. And there will be referees who will not referee a game if there might be any transgendered kid close by. There is something wrong with that. Now, there's a real issue here. I can understand that there are some issues. Okay. Other comments, ideas?
I have this perception, this goes back to when you were talking earlier about the decline of members in Christian churches and stuff like that. And maybe this is a prejudicial thing for me to say, I'll just open up with that. I find it hard to believe that a lot of people that are politically supporting the Christian extremism even set foot in church on Sunday. How could they, I mean, I think it's kind of easy to say I'm a Christian and not go to church. And I find it hard to believe that if you do go to church on a regular basis or work on your relationship with God, that you wouldn't have some kind of aha moment that I need to rethink whether this is true. I don't know.
No, I think you're right about that. And I don't want to be unfair here, but I remember reading, when it first came out, Hillbilly Elegy. And I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in there that was foreign to my own experience. But one of the things was there was this Christian sense of being Christian but they never went to church. They were never part of a community. It's hard for me to understand that.
Yeah.
Sandy?
As I was working through the book, I keep coming across the word fear, that evangelicals fear. And kind of what you're saying, that they don't go to church, but they say they believe. This fear of being taken over by different kinds of people, people of color, that the persecution attitude, and we see it all the way up to the top of the government, fear that someone is going to change what we accept as appropriate.
And normal. Yeah, yeah.
No.
Yeah, change is a hard thing, probably for everybody to cope with, but it's especially hard for some people, I think. And as you've heard me say before, that, from Tom Friedman's book, Thanks for Being Late, the pace of change in this hyper-digital, becoming AI world, social institutions, and indeed governments maybe, have a hard time adjusting to change at the pace we experience. We support, and Julie spends a lot of time on this out there, an Afghan family. They're supported by the church we attend out there, and we help with this. Nasir worked for the U.S. Air Force at Bagram Air Force Base. Married, and they have 4 little kids. And they were given a certain kind of visa to come to this country. I can't remember the letters on it. So they're in a particular status because in the withdrawal, a lot of Afghanis didn't feel like they would be treated very well staying behind with the Taliban. I try to look at our life through their eyes, just being dropped in. Now, they've been here 3 years, and they're just doing amazingly well. But just think about going into a supermarket or having to buy car insurance for your car. The choice is disorienting. At Concordia, we dealt with some of these Sudanese boys who came over. They'd be dropped in, and everybody helping thought they were doing good things. They'd get boxed breakfast cereal, this and that. They didn't know what to do with it. Now, if it comes breakfast out of a box, I'm not sure what to do with it either. But it's disorienting, I think. And maybe we're all somewhat disoriented. Mike.
Well, I look at myself as being a birth defect. I can look around and I could probably say there's not a one of us that are not a birth defect. We have a big habit of being judgmental,
and we're because we're all unique, right?
Pardon?
We're all unique.
We are. We are. And we're not perfect.
Yeah. Mike, you have a nice way of putting things. Yeah. Okay.
That's the key. They said, we love you anyway.
Yeah.
And that's really what this is all about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, if you're just speaking about the ELCA, a few, I think maybe 3 back, the presiding bishop of the ELCA was Herb Chilstrom, a Minnesotan. And Julie got to know him pretty well, and I did too. But it was at the point where it wasn't an issue of trans. It was just still, we were in the world of gay and lesbians and so on. And they had a gay sign. And the local community where we lived wanted to honor Bishop Chilstrom because of his undying work on behalf of gays and lesbians. And I think this was primarily because of Julie, but he asked that she and I make the presentation to him. And I thought, you know, that's a powerful witness back in that part of the world where there are a lot of Lutherans about the stand of the bishop of the ELCA. Now, I'm sure you could find those examples in the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church, Methodist Church, right on down the line. But those become at least a few points of light. Okay, I am going to think a little bit with you about Christian freedom and American freedom and Timothy Snyder. I'm going to put this here so I won't try to read that one when I want to. Speaking about myself here, as a teacher of the Pauline epistles, and way back when, it seems like another lifetime ago, I taught in a high school American history for a couple of years. And over the years, I have thought that we too often use a rather truncated notion or definition of freedom to which we often default. I would say that both as a Christian and as an American, from a Christian point of view and an American point of view. And here the prepositions are absolutely critical. The truncated view of freedom uses the preposition from. We are free from something. Now, just as a intrusion into this, so that there isn't misunderstanding, I think there are things that we should be free from. Whether it's oppression, whether it's one malady or another, I think it's good to be free from certain things. We are set loose from something that holds us in its grip. Physical bondage, addiction, disease, oppression, poverty, hopelessness, sin, guilt. King George III, maybe. And on the other, and on that list could go, but on the other side of freedom, we might ask, what are we set free to or for? You can perhaps appreciate my satisfaction when I began reading Timothy Snyder's book, where he, at the outset of the book, begins by addressing this crucial question. Here's a historian. I don't know if he has any religious background or not. He's a historian, writing as a historian. He begins addressing that crucial question. This professor of Eastern European history at Yale, who almost died, I might say, in the middle of writing this book. He was in Eastern Europe doing work and research, and he acquired an infection that went septic. He was misdiagnosed. They got him back, I think, to Britain and back home, but by that time it had gone septic and he was in a bad way. And I think, from what he says, there was some doubt as to whether he would make it or not. He says, more importantly, is what we affirm if we are free. What is it we affirm? What do we add when we are free? What do we create? What are we free? He uses the preposition to. I would say, what are we free for? Hence, what happens beyond the absence, freedom from, is what is critical and crucial for freedom. He doesn't think you can have liberty by just being free from something. You've got to be free for something. This is where our values and our participation in life come into play. A full-throated notion of freedom is the freedom to, or as I said, the freedom for something. This is clearly not merely the absence of something, but freedom as value added. As I said, for a long time, that's where my thinking has gone. And I think as well that this fuller notion of freedom to or for can contribute mightily to how we might rescue huge swaths of American Christianity from its constantly angry default position of always fighting against something by any means thought necessary. Well, that may be more a hopeful statement than a prediction. Now, I'd like to think, and I think Brian Zahn probably likes to think as well, angry frenzy only goes so far and lasts so long. Might it burn itself out, if that's all it is? But what kind of wreckage will be left in its wake? What really has it stood for? And how does that conform to the teaching of the preacher from Galilee, rather than some politically motivated prophet of power, money, and media prestige? We need not look far to see how American Christianity has suffered from the scandals, for example, of the Catholic Church. From the Catholic Church on the one hand, and wingnut Protestantism on the other. Why should there be any surprise that the pollsters tell us that the fastest growing group, religiously speaking, are the nuns? And I don't mean N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E. For those of us who call ourselves Christians, I think we need to look no further than Galatians 5:13 to 15 to see the basic contours of Christian freedom. Quote, Paul writes, "For you were called to freedom. You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become enslaved to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Through love, become enslaved to one another. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, those of us who have studied the Lutheran classical literature will know that Martin Luther wrote a treatise, The Freedom of a Christian, where he focuses on that. This is the charter of Christian freedom for, and it is clearly not simply freedom from something. The Christian church and every Christian ought, and I say this to myself, ask themselves daily if this is what they are doing. Christian theologians and ethicists over centuries have written volumes and volumes fleshing out what this might mean, let alone all the sermons that have been preached by preachers on this Galatian text. For every American and probably everyone else, Timothy Snyder fleshes out what democratic freedom involves and might look like. He says, quote, "Freedom is about knowing what we value and bringing it to life. It depends on what we do, and that in turn depends on others, people we know, people we don't." Elsewhere he writes, quote, "Freedom is not an absence but a presence, a life in which we choose multiple commitments and realize them in the world in which we live. Over time, our choices among virtues define us as a people of will and individuality," end quote. And with great care in this book, he works out his understanding of freedom in in terms of 5 categories or 5 forms of freedom. In his vocabulary, they are sovereignty, the learned capacity to make choices, unpredictability, the power to adapt physical regularities to personal choices, mobility, the capacity to move through space and time, factuality, the grip on the world that allows us to change it, solidarity, the recognition that freedom is for everyone, not just for me and my kind. These 5 forms provide him with the headings that then he works out historically, philosophically, and personally. And I would argue, at least in his distinction between freedom from and freedom to, Snyder and the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5 represent a point of intersection. And as such, I also think that the Christian community has something to learn from not only Paul, but Timothy Snyder as well. And the larger community that values democratic freedom clearly has something to learn from Timothy Snyder, but maybe, just maybe, also the Apostle Paul. In conclusion, Timothy Snyder echoes something that I said earlier about the singularity or unsingularity of truth. Now, I have thought this way for a long time, but when I read his book, I thought, hey, I think I like this guy. Imperfection enables freedom. Mike, imperfection enables freedom. The world of values is flawed. It cannot be made perfect, but it can be improved. The rocket attack that destroyed the cafe also hit the main cathedral in Odessa. He'd been sitting in Odessa, Ukraine, leaving glass all around. Seeing the world of values is like watching the sun rays scatter through the jagged colors of a broken stained glass window. The light is thrown in many directions, and the rays cross one another. The result is beautiful, but strange, and a bit different every time. At some point, we realize that we can pick up the fragments and make our own patterns. We do not have Eden, a place where all the light comes together, where all good things are united. Nor is there a single truth. of which all the facts are mere parts. And that is why we have a chance at freedom. A fascist philosopher, repeatedly cited by Vladimir Putin, Ivan Ilyin, was haunted by imperfection and called on Russia to overcome it with violence. If there were only one truth and all facts were just elements of it, then some leader or some machine could claim to have calculated the future for us. If there were only one value and all others were just fragments of it, then some leader and some machine could dictate for us the right course of action. But this cannot be done. The space between what is and what ought to be is where we roam as free people, extending the borderland of the unpredictable. We decide which values to affirm, in what combination, for what reasons, and at what time. Then we try again. With practice, we attain our own human form of grace. Now there's a good Christian word for you. Be it in our religious communities or in our religious theological commitments or in our national communities with our social political commitments, every individual and every community will construct freedom differently. There is no single religious truth, there's no single political truth, but there are certainly better and poorer ways of constructing those truths, of constructing freedom, where all our neighbors might flourish, not just a few of them. It seems that collapsing the distinction between religion and the state, either by religion attempting to take over the state or the state trying to drive religion out of the public square or underground or co-opt it, is not finally the way to go either, if we want to enhance freedom for all.
So does
David?
he, his first point is sovereignty. Is that, who gets sovereignty and how does that function in this course of ambiguity?
Yeah. I would think that this whole business of sovereignty is something that is not simply something that is given to us, it's something that is claimed by us. I mean, that is a good question in a variety of ways, but it is also, I'm trying to find my page here. If we wait for somebody to give it to us, we don't have it.
Yeah.
If we claim it for ourselves, it may be certainly imperfect and maybe even partial, but it is authentic.
But then it initiates then the neighborology, because other people then need to have that sovereignty, and then we're in dialogue about.
That's exactly right.
Is it possible to say that sovereignty requires responsibility?
I think so. And the responsibility to and the freedom and liberty to make choices. But I think, that's kind of where you're going, Sherry? And David, I think you're right that it is, it links up with his last point, solidarity. This is for everyone. And we might be, and I'm not sure in my daily life how to do this necessarily, but we might all be better off if we try to help someone else claim their own sovereignty not be perceived as giving it to them, but allowing them to claim it. And assisting them in the choice making that they will do without trying to determine how that will play itself out. If that makes any sense.
Are you suggesting that a certain conception of freedom is part of what lies behind the extremism that Tim Albert has been talking about?
I think there are overlaps here. I don't want to be overly simplistic and say that, or imply that right-wing Christians are in every instance and in every way operating with a deformed notion of freedom. I don't want to make some sort of universal claim like that. I may be condescending, but I don't want to appear to be so. But I think the word in Christian communities, whether it's Greg Locke going to Missoula or anybody else, is quick to talk about Christian freedom. Which means then we have to start digging beneath the surface to figure out what that might look like. And I would say that isn't just how conservative right-wing Christians ought to operate. I think we all ought to operate that way in some sense. What does this look like? We think we're doing something noble in the way we frame Christian liberty and Christian freedom and all those things, but we do have to ask ourselves the question, how's this playing itself out and how is it perceived by others? I think there are a whole lot of people who are not in pews, Christian church pews or any other kinds of pews, who think, basically, that good old-time Christian religion is anything but free. It's telling us what we do, how we ought to believe, and how we ought to act, or not. And sometimes that's just been the way it has been, too. Am I making any sense here?
How do you think the idea of American freedom became the default for the American church?
Well, I'm sure as we have been dumped onto this continent, already inhabited by indigenous folks, and coming from one place or another in the world, except Native Americans, I think we have developed a highly, I don't want to use the word extreme, but
Specific?
a highly specific understanding of individuals and individuality. Now that doesn't mean we haven't been social in this country, ethnic communities and so on and so on. But individuality is a prized reality for most of us. Now, if I'm right about that, we will probably frame notions of freedom that suggest anything that inhibits my individuality and my individual action is somehow the opposite of freedom. I do think that most Americans take their families as a social group seriously. And probably immediate, next concentric circle out. It's harder, though, if we don't see ourselves as part of bigger communities. And if you are, I don't know that anybody in here qualifies, I know I sure don't, but if you're a billionaire and you want more tax cuts, doesn't there seem to be something odd and offbeat about that? All it says to me is that greed is insatiable. There is no satiating it. And I don't want to be overly political here, but I can speak about my wife here for a moment. She's not here. She's home with a sty in her head. She wasn't feeling good. She came from a very Republican family. One of her uncles was the executive director of the Republican Senators' Re-Election Committee in Washington, D.C. The year we lived in Washington, D.C., we spent a lot of time with him. And he and I got along really well. He'd call me a communist, and I would call him something else, you know. But we really liked each other. She had another uncle who came within a whisker of becoming the Republican governor of Washington State. Now, I disagreed with their politics. Had I understood this fully, maybe Julie and I would have never gotten married in the first place. But here's the moral of that story is, of the two of us now, I'm the more conservative, I think. No, I'm pretty blue, but I'm all over the place. On some issues, I'm left of Bernie. On some issues, I'm pretty doggone conservative. I think there are historical and religious realities that come from 2,000 years ago that ought to be living today. I'm conservative about that. I grew up in a family of pioneers 250 miles east of here. Immigrants, homesteaders, people who learned how to work just to stay alive in the winter, and they discovered a government that saved their bacon during the Depression. And they never forgot it. So, I don't like to think of myself as a partisan hack at all. But I do have some values about how we, as a country, as a society or set of societies, care for the most vulnerable neighbors we have. And I don't mean just on this block, but throughout the country. And it just doesn't strike me as consistent with that to take health insurance away from people who can't afford it. Food banks don't have enough food, and there is more than enough food to make everybody rotund in this country if we figured out how to distribute it. Just doesn't seem right. And I, for the longest time, thought in Congress and in Washington that there were legislators of both parties who agreed on the goal. They would debate and have different agreements about how to get there, and I think that's legitimate. The worst thing in the world is to have every policy I think is a good idea be the order of the day without any debate, without any critique, without any assessment. That doesn't work. But I'm not sure we're there anymore. You pay to play in this, and the more money you have, the more you can pay to play. And more people you can play with then. And there are more than a few people willing to be bought and paid for, I guess. On those cheery notes.
Where's Dwight Eisenhower when you really need him?
Yeah. Well, and I know that wandered from your question, but I think it's from a kind of staunch individualism can emerge a rabid individualism. I don't care about anybody else. Just give me a tax break. There are some societies, I know our time's just, am I reading the clock right? Yeah. Our time's just about up. There are some societies where we look at society as made up of individuals, and a collection of individuals makes up the society. There are societies that look at it the other way around. The community is the order of the day, made up of different individuals, but the community is what is really front and center.
Isn't that the body of Christ?
Exactly. You're gonna say this guy's crazy, but here I am in retirement, and I'm sitting in my study, not working on these essays, but I'm writing an article on Galatians 3 and 4, which is about the body of Christ. We are one in Christ. Now, that's exactly your point. And I've been thinking about it directly with regard to Paul's letter to the Galatians. When I should be outside hiking, I'm sitting. You know, I have thoroughly...
You have freedom to choose.
And maybe choose badly, BJ.
Don't you think that body of Christ is pretty much more than people?
Let me hear that again.
The body of Christ is much more than people, because Christ is in animals, in nature, in plants, animals, all of which we...
The holistic sense of creation. The cosmos. Yes. Oh, I think that's right. And as our younger members of our society know, our children and grandchildren know, that we've got a problem out here with what we're doing to the, if not the whole cosmos, at least this part of it.
I just wanted to thank you for one thing. I was thinking on the way here, what is it that I've gotten out of the reading and the talking? And one thing that I found is that I've spent lots of time in the last few years thinking about the political situation we are in. And I've not spent very much time at all with a heart for the body of Christ and how Christianity itself is doing. And this study has brought me that probably more fruitful question. How
Well,
is the
good,
body
good,
of Christ
yeah,
doing?
yeah.
What can I do for us as the body of Christ? I think that's maybe more promising.
Yeah, and it's all, the body of Christ is all over the map out here in this country and globally. But we each have our own bit part to do. It seems to me.
You used to call it in-reach or outreach.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some in-reach is.
Yeah, and we don't have to set those against each other. They're both in play.
You don't want to ignore one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks indeed for coming, folks, and sharing your ideas and thoughts, and maybe we will leave each just a little bit wiser. So thank you.
That wasn't small class.
Well, you know,